Mr. President, as I began with last night at 4 in the morning, now 5:30, let me again thank the staff, both the nonpartisan staff and those in the majority and minority, for enduring another late night. These are exceptional times, and thus we are here again in the early morning to talk about a nomination to the president's cabinet. As my colleagues have before me, this is my first time on the floor since Senator Warren was gavelled down last evening. Let me just speak for a moment about my deep disappointment at the events of early last evening. I want to put this in the context of the political moment that we are living in. We have a president of the United States today who is a bully, who is using his office to try to stifle and quell debate. If you dare oppose him, frankly, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you are going to be called names. You are going to be mocked in an effort to try to silence you. And in the last week, we have seen President Trump attempt this tactic on members of the judiciary. When he got a ruling he didn't like from a judge in Washington that temporarily halted his ban on Muslims entering the country, he started personally attacking this judge, sending a signal to those in the judicial branch that if you dare oppose him, you are going to be singled out for ridicule. The President of the United States is going to try to destroy your reputation and your career as a judge, as a jurist, as an impartial arbiter of the law if you rule against his political interests. It's an exceptional moment. It's an exceptional moment in which the President of the United States is trying to bully judges into ruling in his favor. It's an exceptional moment, though we've been watching it for the last 2 years, in which a president is trying to bully members of Congress to cow to his interests. And so I want to be very careful about how I talk about this, because I have great respect for the parliamentary rulings of this body, but I don't understand why our majority leader chose to gavel down Senator Warren when she was simply reading a letter from Coretta Scott King. We celebrate the legacy of Martin Luther King with a holiday every year in this country, in the pantheon of individual greatness in the United States of America. It doesn't get any higher than Martin Luther King. And his widow wrote us a letter expressing her objections to the nomination of Jeff Sessions based upon the belief that he would not live up to the legacy of her husband and his work in civil rights. Nothing could be more relevant to this discussion. The opinion of a member of Martin Luther King's family on whether or not this nominee was going to enforce appropriately and vigorously the civil rights laws of this nation. And Senator Warren was silenced. Now, I don't know what the motive was, and it certainly would be inappropriate for me to guess at it, but the effect of the majority leader's action is to stifle debate, to make it less likely that members of the Democratic minority will raise objections to Senator Sessions' nomination and record objections as to his conduct. And I'm not trying to equate what happened here last night with what our president has done, but there is a practice now. There is a pattern of behavior amongst Republicans trying to stifle and quell opposition to this president. The president uses the bullying power of Twitter, and the majority leader now is twisting the rules of the United States Senate. I say that because, well, it may be true that technically the rules of the Senate don't allow you to talk about the conduct of a fellow senator. How on earth can you debate a nominee from this body to the cabinet without questioning their conduct? And so technically the rule may say that you cannot talk about the conduct of a fellow senator, but how on earth can this body operate when members of it are nominated to important positions if we cannot talk about the conduct of fellow members and we cannot criticize the conduct of fellow members? Now, I appreciate the fact that Senator Merkley was able to come down to the floor and read the full letter into the record overnight. I appreciate the fact that Senator Booker was able to read into the record testimony from another civil rights hero, John Lewis, without being similarly gavelled down for their conduct. But this effort, this continued effort to try to stop people who oppose President Trump and his agenda from speaking truth to power, it's not right. It's not right, and it will frankly have the opposite effect. You've seen what happened overnight on our side. We are not going to stop talking about Senator Sessions' record and how we believe that it is disqualifying as to his nomination for Attorney General. And the protests and the numbers of people gathering around the country to object to the policies of President Trump are getting bigger and bigger the more that he bullies and bullies. This isn't going to work. And so, Mr. President, I'm going to speak to Senator Sessions' record. I'm going to speak to how I believe it does not qualify him to be Attorney General. And that doesn't mean that I don't have great respect for him. I've worked with Senator Sessions on a number of issues. But if I can't talk about Senator Sessions' record, if I can't talk about his conduct as a United States Senator as it relates to whether or not he can be the chief law enforcement official in this country, then there's no use in having this debate at all. Senator Sessions has publicly called the Voting Rights Act intrusive. And in response to the Supreme Court's 2013 decision in Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, which gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, Senator Sessions called it a good thing for the South. That decision made it vastly more difficult for the federal government to protect individuals from racial discrimination in voting, and the Supreme Court effectively substituted their political judgment on the status of racism in America for the judgment of this Congress. Effectively, the Supreme Court was saying in that decision that in our belief, racism is no longer a problem in the way that it was when the Voting Rights Act was passed, and thus there is no longer an imperative for Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which allows for the federal government to oversee the voting laws of a select number of countries with patterns of racial discrimination. That was an absurd ruling. I have great respect for the members of the Supreme Court, but they live inside the ivory ensconced marble of the Supreme Court chamber. They don't have experience on the ground like elected members of this body do to understand the reality of racism in America today. I wish it were gone, but it is not. Blacks and Hispanics are still discriminated against. And you just have to look to see what happened in North Carolina to understand the truth of that. North Carolina passed a number of laws which on their face they argued were not discriminatory. They were just, in their words, voter protections, buffers against voter fraud. And then what we learned when we read the correspondence of the members of the state legislature who passed that law is that they were specifically intended to try to stop African Americans from voting. The people that were passing those laws were talking to each other, trying to figure out how they could most effectively target laws to stop African Americans from voting. That was their clear intent, even though they argued that there was no racial bias implicit in the passage of that law. Racism is not dead in America. You don't wash away discrimination just one generation, a generation and a half maybe, after laws that separated the races with respect to public accommodations and restaurants and drinking fountains and bathrooms. That doesn't just vanish one generation later. Everybody understands that. And poll after poll will show you that there are still people in this country who believe that African Americans and Hispanics are inferior. I wish that weren't the case, but it is. And so we still need the Voting Rights Act. We still need the Civil Rights Act. And we are about to vote on a nominee to be the Attorney General who calls the Voting Rights Act intrusive, who says that a Supreme Court decision that guts the Voting Rights Act is a good thing for the South. It's not a good thing for African Americans in the South. It's not a good thing for Hispanics in the South. It may be a good thing for the people that wrote those discriminatory laws, but it's not a good thing for those that are trying to vote, who have witnessed and lived through decades of discrimination. Mr. President, let me talk about Senator Sessions' record on immigration. In 2007, Senator Sessions referred to a comprehensive immigration reform bill as terrorist assistance. He's been a leading voice in Congress arguing against immigration reform. In 2 decades in the Senate, Senator Sessions has opposed every single immigration bill that has included a pathway to citizenship. He has favored, similar to President Trump, an ideological test for admission to the United States. He said this: immigration policy must be guided by our understanding that Western society is unique and special. Our values, our rules, our traditions are what make our societies succeed where others fail. It's necessary and proper to choose who among the world's 7 billion people will be granted the high honor of immigration to the United States on the basis of confidence that they share our values. That's a radical idea. Let's just think about that for a second. The Attorney General of the United States will make important decisions about the enforcement of immigration law in this country. Much of what happens in immigration policy happens in the Department of Homeland Security, but the Attorney General makes important decisions about upholding the law on immigration policy. And we are about to vote to confirm a member of this body who has said that there should be an ideological test for admission to the United States, that you have to share our values. Now, I don't know what that means, but the greatness of the United States is based on the fact that we have been able to bring people from a variety of different backgrounds, a variety of different value sets, a variety of different religions, bring them into this country and allow them to keep part of their heritage, part of their belief system from the places that they came, whether they be Ireland or England or China or Mexico, and then also assimilate into the whole, right? Adopt, part of this country's short history of traditions over the last 240 years. What makes America great is that we allow people to bring different values from ours into this country, which in turn strengthens our collective set of values because we're constantly challenging ourselves with new ideas, with new perspectives. Senator Sessions has been an opponent of the delayed action for childhood arrivals policy. This is commonly referred to as DACA, the idea that if you were a child who came to this country when you were very young, knowing nothing other than the United States, an American in name, if not legal status, that you should be able to stay in this country. That it's just cruel and inhumane to take a young man or woman who came to this country when they were 3 or 4 years old and send them back to their country of birth. And I think Democrats and Republicans of goodwill generally agree, if not on the broad aspects of a pathway to citizenship, that for these kids, these dreamers as we call them, they should be able to stay in the United States. But Senator Sessions has vigorously opposed this policy. And many DACA-protected immigrants now fear deportation under a Department of Justice that is led by Senator Sessions. His conduct in this body tells us that he opposes protections for young men and women who know nothing other than the United States, who simply want to have a shot at the American dream. That conduct is relevant to whether he is qualified to be Attorney General or not. Mr. President, on criminal justice reform, Senator Sessions has personally blocked the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act, which is a bipartisan effort spearheaded by Senators Grassley and Lee and Cornyn and Speaker of the House Paul Ryan. And as Attorney General, Senator Sessions will have the power to direct federal prosecutors throughout the country to pursue the harshest penalties possible for even low-level drug offenses, a step that would further exacerbate our national record of incarcerating nonviolent offenders, the vast majority of which could be successfully treated at far lower cost to society with appropriate health care treatment for their addiction or mental illness. Senator Sessions' conduct in this body has been to oppose efforts to try to treat with more compassion and common sense offenders in this country who would be better served through treatment than through incarceration. And so it is relevant to his nomination to be Attorney General, where he will have broad discretion to lock up people for low-level offenses. In Connecticut, we've made the decision to divert people who are convicted of crimes but have serious mental illness or addiction into treatment. We've made the decision to reserve our prison system for the worst of the worst, mainly for violent offenders or those that are convicted of serious crimes. And Connecticut has seen its prison population fall to a 20-year low. A 20-year low. On September 3rd of last year, the prison population in Connecticut dropped below 15,000 for the first time since January of 1997. At the same time, rates of reported violent crime have plummeted in Connecticut. So the proof is in the pudding in my state. My state has reduced its prison population and at the same time has reduced its level of violent crime. And many states can tell the same story. And yet, Senator Sessions, we can predict through his record on the floor of the United States Senate, may use his power as Attorney General to reverse that trend line and lock up more of my constituents, which I would argue will have an upward effect on the rates of violent crime. Why? Because those individuals, having gone through the process of incarceration, coming out unreformed, untreated, will be no less of a danger to society. And finally, Mr. President, I want to talk about the issue of gun violence in this country. Obviously, this is very personal to me. Still watching the community of Newtown spiral through ripples of grief associated with the trauma of December of 2012. And Senator Sessions and I clearly have differences about the way in which the federal government should restrict the flow of firearms in this country. It has to be relevant to the decision that I make, right? This is the chief law enforcement official of this country. And so the views on firearms is relevant. Whether or not the Attorney General has the discretion to make policy or not on the issue of what firearms are legal and what aren't, or what sales are subject to background checks and what aren't, there is a bully pulpit associated with the chief law enforcement official that carries weight. And so Senator Sessions' beliefs on firearms policy are relevant. His record and his conduct in the United States Senate on the question of gun violence is relevant to whether or not he should be our next Attorney General. And Senator Sessions has lined up with the gun lobby over and over again against common sense reform of our gun laws that are supported by 90% of Americans. He has voted against expanding background checks to cover sales at gun shows or online. He has voted against a bipartisan effort in the Senate to make sure that if you are on the terrorist watch list, you cannot purchase a weapon. He has voted against efforts to try to restrict sales of high-capacity magazines and assault weapons, the kind of magazines and the kind of weapon that were used in the horrific crime in Sandy Hook. But what Senator Sessions has said is that if he was confirmed, he pledged that he would take on the rising homicide rates in some American cities by working against illegal firearms use. He's pledged that he will enforce the law. And yet, again, coming back to his conduct and his record in this body, he has been part of an effort to try to strip from the Department of Justice and its appendages the tools that they need in order to enforce the law. So every year we have on our appropriations bills riders that specifically stop the ATF from enforcing existing law. We restrict their ability to do inventories of gun dealers. We prohibit them from keeping modern databases on gun sales across the country. Policy that Senator Sessions has backed and voted for in this body run contrary to the statements that he's made. He has supported efforts to rob from the Department of Justice the ability to enforce the law, the existing law on guns. And yet he says when he gets there, he is going to use all efforts to enforce the law. Further, he has opposed efforts to give new tools to the Department of Justice to try to keep our streets safer. Specifically, we debated on this floor shortly after Sandy Hook legislation that would make it a federal crime to traffic in illegal guns. I don't know how much less controversial you can get when it comes to gun policy. We all agree that you shouldn't be able to walk into a store, buy guns saying that they're for you, and then go out onto the streets and sell them to criminals. That happens all the time in our cities, right? Somebody goes and buys a mess of guns at a gun store or a gun show and then goes into a city and sells them out of the trunk of a car to criminals who couldn't otherwise go buy those guns because of their criminal background. And so we proposed a simple federal law that would make it a federal crime to do that. And you need that because states can't enforce that on a state-by-state basis because these guns are often trafficked across state lines. And Senator Sessions voted against that. He's not going to be a champion for enforcing the gun laws of this nation. His record is not going to magically transform when he becomes Attorney General. I have great respect for Senator Sessions, but he has been a chief opponent of making the gun laws of this country more amenable to proper and appropriate and efficient enforcement. And that's not going to change when he becomes Attorney General. So I'm going to vote against his nomination later today, and I encourage my colleagues to do so as well. His record on civil rights, on criminal justice, on immigration, and on gun policy do not qualify him to be Attorney General. And I am deeply sad about what happened here last night with respect to the letter read into the record by Senator Warren. And I understand that things seem to be breaking down a little bit in this chamber, that nerves are frayed and people are acting in ways that maybe they wouldn't have acted a few years ago. These are exceptional times, right? We've never seen a president like this trying to divide us from each other, using his position to bully and intimidate his political opponents, raving about a brutal dictator in Moscow who murders people who disagree with him. We've never seen a moment like this. But we should be really careful that we don't model his behavior here in the United States Senate. And what makes me sad is that it looked to me like that's what happened last night. That this body, that the majority party, tried to use the rules of the Senate in order to bully members of the minority into silence. It's not going to work. And if we want to get back to being able to function as a body, then we better be okay with being able to have some open, honest conversations about the future of this country and the future of this cabinet. I'm going to vote against Senator Sessions today. That doesn't mean that I haven't enjoyed working with him on a number of subjects, but he's not the right person to be Attorney General. He's not close, frankly. And I hope that over the course of the day, my colleagues continue to talk about his conduct, continue to talk about his record, and continue to explain why it does not qualify him in any way, shape, or form to be the chief law enforcement official in this country.